Welcome to the 24th edition of the Education Leadership Forum focused on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. Thank you for investing your time with us on this weekday to attend the Global Distinguished Lecture featuring Dr. Jeanette Berman. We deeply appreciate your presence and participation. My name is Aryan Salvan, and I'm here to welcome the guest lecturer for the day. Yesterday we had the pleasure of engaging with a stellar panel on building bridges to inclusive learning. Today, we will delve deeper to explore the strategies and best practices for education leaders to build bridges to inclusive learning. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Jeanette Berman. Dr. Berman has worked as a teacher and a school psychologist in Australia before moving into teacher education. With a focus on inclusive education, she works at the University of New England and the University of Canberra. She subsequently has served as Director of Educational Psychology at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand, before moving to the University of Melbourne and postgraduate teaching in learning intervention. Dr. Berman is now a Principal Fellow at the University of Melbourne as she moves closer to full retirement. Dr. Berman received the Order of Australia Medal in 2023 for her services in education and continues her private practice in psychology of learning and learning difficulties. She continues to write with colleagues at Melbourne University, and her distinguished global lecture today is part of the most recent publication released this week by Routledge in the UK. For those of you who are new to the Education Leadership Forum, the Education Leadership Forum was started with a mission to provide a platform for education leaders to shape, empower, influence, and advance this discourse on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. Our goal is to create a space where experts, practitioners, and education leaders from across the globe can come together to share their knowledge, insights, best practices towards achieving this critical mission. This distinguished global lecture today marks the culmination of the 24th edition of the Online Education Leadership Forum. Through the Forum online series, the Global Citizenship Foundation and the Council for Global Citizenship Education are committed to supporting education leaders and educators in their efforts to transform education for human and planetary flourishing. We believe that by connecting with one another and sharing our ideas and experiences, we can create positive change in the world and ensure that all learners have the tools, resources, and inspirations they need to succeed. Whether you're an educator, administrator, or policymaker, we believe that you'll come away with something valuable, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful at doing what you're doing best. So by investing your time in your own continuous professional development, you not only ensure that your work improves, but you also ensure that education continues to evolve and improve for people all around the world. So we hope this distinguished global lecture on strategies and best practices for education leaders to build bridges to inclusive learning contributes to your efforts to impact your learners, peers, and the wider community. I warmly welcome Dr. Berman to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Aryan. It's a privilege to be here, to be able to share some of our ideas with you, and hopefully they might resonate with you and they might prompt some more thinking and questioning about what it is we do in education. I would like to start by acknowledging the country on which I am working, which is Anaiwan country in northern New South Wales in Australia. I like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and recognise that education has been carried out on this country for tens of thousands of years, and we are continuing in that tradition. The work that I'm going to share with you has been mainly developed in Anaiwan country and in Wurundjeri country in Victoria, in Melbourne. And my colleagues are all at Melbourne University. From the picture that I have shown you, the map, it shows you all the nations that are within Australia. all the First Nations. So we're not just one country, we have many nations. I'm going to talk about responsive leadership. We've just completed this book, and so the work that I'm going to share with you is what we did to prepare for this book, which has just come out this week. I received my copies yesterday, which is exciting. So where did this work come from? It's been the work of 3 and 4 of us over the last nearly decade. 3 of us worked at the University of New England, which is a regional university in Australia, and got together to start to reflect on what it was that we did as teachers and whether we could capture that and make it into a coherent story for our teaching as teacher educators. At the time, 3 of us were at the University of New England, but since then we've spread out. And when I went to Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and went to the Southern Cross University, which is another regional university in New South Wales, and Lorraine went to be Foundation Professor of Learning Intervention at Melbourne University. Since then, we were asked to work in Ecuador, and we took our work about responsive teaching, responsive leadership, sustainable learning to Ecuador and worked with hundreds of teachers face to face. And then subsequently, there's been work with thousands of teachers online. Our work has also gone into undergraduate and graduate university courses in South America. The 3 books on the side of this slide are how we have captured our thinking as we've been progressing through our careers. The top book is Sustainable Learning, which is the first one, and I'll share the foundations that come from that. The second one is Learning Intervention, which is about the educational casework that people such as myself, as school psychologists, do when we're focusing on individual learners and trying to make sense of what it is that's supporting their learning or getting in the way of their learning. And the third book is the one that came out this week, which is the Responsive Teaching for Sustainable Learning. And it's based on the work, the face-to-face teaching work we did in Ecuador with practicing classroom teachers to try and demystify inclusive education and make it something other than an add-on, make it integral to everything that classroom teachers do. So now I'm going to share the foundations with you. The main foundation for all our work is the notion of sustainable learning. It's our way of making sense of what inclusive education is all about. And we have 3 tenets: learning for all, so that we meet the needs of all the students who come to our schools, all our learners, and everyone should come. Learning that lasts, so that we're focusing on what it is that people need for this really complex, dynamic, changing world that we live in. And the teaching is what matters. Teaching is so important. It is what can be the difference between a young person succeeding as a learner or not. We know how powerful and important teachers are, and we need to work at what it is that makes really good teachers. What is it that really makes a difference for learners, and particularly learners who bring barriers with them to their learning, who maybe struggle with learning or have particular disabilities that get in the way for them. So that's our foundation, inclusive education as sustainable learning. Learning that lasts is about setting people up to be lifelong learners, and Arian talked about that in the introduction. We all need to be continuing learners, or in our language, sustained learners. We want learning that lasts, that sets people up so that they can continue to learn and adapt to the changing world within which we live. The way we can do this is to focus on capabilities. So we've taken a capabilities approach in our work, and we have selected 5 capabilities and called them Atrium. It's the acronym for the capabilities we have here. For anyone who is from Aotearoa, New Zealand, this will be very familiar because they align very closely with the capabilities in the New Zealand curriculum. Many countries around the world have sets of capabilities, and it's really fascinating to look at the different emphases that different countries have selected. Some countries, such as Denmark, only have about 3. New Zealand has 5, and Australia has more than that. I'm sure there were many, many more people on the committee when they decided what their capabilities were going to be. But for us, the 5 that were derived from Aotearoa, New Zealand, capture what it is that we want people to grow into. We want them to be active learners, letter A, thinkers. We want them to relate to others, to use language, symbol systems, and information communication technology. And we want them to be effective at managing themselves. So that, in a nutshell, is our set of capabilities. The photo on the front of our new book, and you can see that I'm quite pleased with it, is a photograph of an atrium in Quito, in the capital of Ecuador. So that was quite significant for us because that was where we did a lot of this work. An atrium is important because it's where the light comes in, and it's about looking out and the possibilities and growth. So atrium is really wonderful metaphor for us. It's also been really significant that atrium can translate quite effectively into atrio in Spanish. So we were able to take the same framework and use it in a Spanish context. We've had learning for all, learning that lasts, and now the third tenet is teaching that matters. It's looking at what teachers do. We've encapsulated that into responsive teaching. So we now are focusing on responsive teaching for sustainable learning. We're acknowledging that it happens within a set of a very complex ecosystem or ecosystems, and there are many, many influences on what it is that teachers and learners do inside their classrooms and their schools and their communities. So we need to acknowledge those. We know that all students and all of us as teachers bring things that influence our teaching and learning relationships. Responsive teaching is supported by evidence. We use evidence at every step of teaching. Some of that we get from other sources, and some of that we generate ourselves, but our practice is evidence supported. I'll share that. Yes, this is our model for how we see evidence. We can have evidence from research, which is the spotlight on the left, but it only shines a small light on what it is that is happening for teachers and learners. We also need to look at the evidence that comes from our own professional experience. Every time we try a strategy in teaching, we get feedback about how effective it has been, and that influences whether we will use it again or whether we will adapt it, change it, so that it can be used more effectively. Over the years, we build in that sort of evidence into our practice. Some of it is really conscious, But much of it is unconscious. It's implicit to how we function as social beings, as teachers. But we need to become conscious of all of our strategies, how effective they are, and make sure that we don't keep using strategies that are not doing the right thing. So that's the second type of evidence that we use in our practice. The third one is evidence from student and family experience. And in the context of educational casework of children who come to school with disabilities or other aspects of their circumstances that make learning really difficult, we need to hear from them about what it is that works for them in learning and how teaching can best be shaped for them to learn best. I've been involved in many cases where families, they know what has been tried previously in other settings. They know how effective various strategies have been. And we don't want somebody just coming in and coming up with the same initial idea that might have been tried previously. We need to take into account these people's experiences. And the fourth sort of evidence is the evidence that we deliberately gather all the time while we're teaching about what it is we do, what effect it has on the learner, and how effective it has been, whether it's useful to use again. So we don't have a narrow view of evidence. It's not just the research that's carried out in experiments. It's much broader than that. We absolutely need to use that sort of evidence, but we need to use all the others as well. Responsive teaching we have framed in a cycle, and you don't need to read the very tiny print that's there. There are 8 reflective and evaluative questions that guide responsive teaching. This lecture is not about responsive teaching, except it's really important to understand what that is because it's integrally linked to responsive leadership. So as I said, there are 8 reflective questions. We'll visit those a little bit later. And decisions that are made within each of those processes for planning, for teaching and assessment, for evaluation and reflection is based on evidence. Classroom teachers can't do responsive teaching for sustainable learning without really good leadership. We need responsive leadership so that it supports the best possible practice in classrooms and in schools. And for us, responsive leadership is based in a number of different principles. And the first one is that the leadership is to be inclusive and ethical, and to focus on equity. We are aiming at developing inclusive cultures in our educational settings, inclusive policies and practices. We want to ensure the teaching is the best it can possibly be and that we get successful learning. In some languages, teach and learn are the same word. But in English, they are very different terms, and it is possible for people to teach without much learning happening. We don't want that. We actually want them to be the same thing. Good teaching will result in successful learning. Responsive leadership also depends on sharing responsibility, on everyone in an educational setting being responsible for everyone in the educational setting. The children with special needs or special education needs or disabilities are not just the responsibility of the special educators. They are everybody's responsibility. More broadly, responsive leadership has to be culturally responsive. There are enormous cultural mismatches between many families and the culture of the school. We need to deal with that mismatch in such a way that everybody belongs and that the school is not a culturally alien place. It's a safe place for everybody. We've already talked about sustained learning. Leaders have to be continual learners. They have to be sustainable learners, and they need to be able to adapt. Again, we've mentioned the notion of using evidence and reason. There needs to be logic and evidence that helps us make good decisions. And last of all, it's sustainability. Leadership needs to be sustainable. I'm going to now unpack some of those for you. Inclusion and equity, it's the foundation for what it is that we're doing. First of all, the key idea is that we need to value diversity, not see it as something that's a problem or a challenge. It's actually really enriching. It's what makes our world so vibrant. So instead of seeing it as a difficulty for teaching, we should see it as a resource, as something really valuable. I've also noted there that we don't rely on classification. Special education traditionally classifies children as normal, within normal limits, average, or not. And so we have children who are identified and classified as having special needs or a particular type of disability, and then they're sorted according to that, with the sense that the type of teaching that's going to happen for some people needs to be different to the type of teaching that happens for other people. And we challenge that. We know that there needs to be some very specific, specialised supports and strategies used for particular disabilities, but it doesn't mean we need to separate and support and segregate children and provide different teachers for them. If we do more team teaching, we can make sure we provide everything every student needs without separating them from each other. The next point is about a community philosophy of inclusion. The key idea is that everyone accesses the learning and the resourcing that they need. And for me, if students are not getting the teaching they need and being successful learners, it's not inclusion. Inclusion is not just putting everybody in the same school. It's putting people together as they flexibly and making sure they get what they need. Leaders need to establish the conditions within which the teachers know all their students as learners, so they know how they learn and they are continually understanding how the students learn. They're also seeing each other as human beings rather than as teacher, student. Removing barriers to learning and ensuring full participation for everybody is really important. Moving towards the teaching that matters, we emphasise that teaching needs to be responsive to what we know about the students as learners, and it needs to be differentiated. Differentiation is not something that we just add on, it is integral to teaching. And if you watch a parent with two children, they will interact differently with those two children, probably because they have different needs, different interests, different ages. We do the same thing in classroom teaching. Good classroom teachers will engage with different students in different ways because they know what is most effective for those students. We need to make this more systemic and more usual. It's not something that we just add on. The last point there is about multi-tiered or layered approaches. And we need to do that so that we're providing universal evidence-based teaching for everybody, and then we're providing variations in that, in intensity, depending on students' needs. So what do inclusive schools look and feel like? There's been quite a lot of work done in this field, and one of the dominant people is Mel Ainscough, and the Index for Inclusion. It has 3 dimensions to it, which I'm going to unpack in the next slide. But basically, the underpinning for all of this is that there is a central ethic of care for everyone, for all students. So saying that we can't have this student because we don't have what that student needs really, ideally, should never happen. We should always be able to provide what is needed. The Index for Inclusion gives us these 3 dimensions, that educational leaders will be focusing on creating inclusive cultures, and it has 2 points there: building the community and establishing inclusive values. Within each of those, there are multiple indicators, other factors that you can think about for your practice, for your schools. Many of you will be familiar with this already. Then we have developing policies, so and practices. So the general idea is that you get the cultures established, and within that you develop inclusive policies and practices. That's quite a useful tool for schools. It has been translated into many, many languages, and it's also been adapted for different cultures. There's an Australian adaptation, because even though we speak English and we were a British colony, we still have the King of England as our king. Our culture is very different. So we needed a change too. Ainscough also pushes the notion of whole system approach. So it's not just something you do as a school, it needs to be broader than that, to the community and to the whole system. Don't try and read this. The text is tiny, but I just wanted to show you that UNESCO also has quite good frameworks about leading inclusive school development, developing inclusive practices and working with partners. And for people who are in the positions of responsibility for doing this, that can be a really useful framework for you as well. Continuing on with the principles of leadership in inclusive education, equity of resourcing is fundamental. Leaders need to really push for getting the right resources. The second point I've put there is an illustration that Australia has one of the least equitable education systems in the world. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen it deteriorate enormously for lots of reasons, probably similar political reasons for many parts of the world. But I think that the scary thing here is that in Australia, a student who moves from a disadvantaged school into an advantaged school might make a gain of up to 3 years in learning. Whereas if that were to happen in, for example, Poland, Norway and Finland, there would be no difference. So it's much more equitable across schools in other education systems. Ours is dreadful. If education is supposed to be a major vehicle, as I've put there, for reducing inequity, we need to change some of that because it isn't working at the moment. So enough of that. When I was doing this work, one of the fields of academic thinking that I went into was that of Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledges are becoming much more accessible for educators, and it increases the richness of what we are able to do, but it also helps us develop shared understandings about what's important in education. And when there's a cultural mismatch between an Indigenous community and the school system, we need to start sharing and negotiating meaning and knowledges so that we can make school much more culturally safe and resonant for all of our students. There are some really important principles in Indigenous education and Indigenous knowledges that resonate with the work that we've been doing, and the emphasis on socially just education. Expectations are important. I supervised an honours psychology student in the last few years who looked at teachers' implicit bias against Australian Aboriginal children, and it was evident that this is still an issue in classrooms. And it might be that teachers are not conscious that they're doing that, but there is a more general sense that I don't expect my Aboriginal students to do very well. We need to challenge that, we need to recognise it, and we need to change it. There can be tension between what the system expects of education settings and what the community, particularly Indigenous community, want to happen. Ways of being, ways of seeing, ways of doing that come from Indigenous communities may not match the more Western view of accountability. It's a challenge that we need to be conscious of. Building on that is cultural responsiveness, or being culturally responsive in everything we do in teaching. Again, I think this comes down to valuing diversity and to the excitement of understanding other people's cultures, other people's ways of seeing things. Colonialism, which is in the second point there, is a continuing issue in countries that have been colonised. I became really conscious of this when I worked in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and as I've come back to Australia, it is becoming a contemporary issue here as well. At the moment, we are having a referendum to acknowledge the Aboriginal people in our constitution. I think we're the last of the British Commonwealth countries to do this. And there are lots of argument about it. It's I probably won't go there. It's not good. Okay. We want to empower communities. Education is about social justice. It's about empowerment. It's about self-determination. We need to make sure that we include that in our engagement with communities. Engaging in Indigenous cultural practices. Again, in New Zealand, I learnt a lot about the tikanga, or the protocols that are needed when people meet, when they have lectures like this. And in Australia, one of our traditions is the acknowledgement of country that I gave at the beginning. Moving on from that, again, we have decolonising school leadership. So this group of researchers has been working on how we do that, and they've come up with these 5 points, the five aspects that you need to focus on. The same themes are coming through: self-determination, community empowerment, voices, and collectivism. Excuse me. Please don't worry about reading these as well. This is just an example that leadership for learning and teaching is really important at the moment. In the 1970s, there was a focus in Australia, particularly on instructional leadership. And that wave came back again in 2000. The OECD in 2013 also focused really clearly on what learning leadership means. So reading some of that work can be really, really helpful for educational leaders. We've already said this a couple of times. We need to be sustained learners and adaptable leaders. We need to constantly learn. We need to be on the lookout all the time for things that build our capabilities as leaders. We need to reflect on our practice and respond to feedback. So to help us grow more so that we connect more effectively. The adaptiveness that's mentioned here came to the fore during COVID, where all of a sudden, many schools around the world had to find a way of teaching students who weren't coming to school. They were at home and they were being supervised by parents or tried to be supervised by parents who were still trying to do their jobs as well. It gave us insights into, I think, for lots of students, the time they spend at school could be altered considerably because they managed to get through the set work very, very quickly. And for other students, they found it really, really difficult because they didn't have anybody there mediating those activities for them, interpreting it, clarifying, all those things that we do as teachers. However, the skills in adaptation that were shown by classroom teachers and schools and educational leaders were amazing. It was really profound. I've been working in a university for decades that does online learning. That is what our regional university, it's been doing distance learning for decades and decades. So the change for me as an academic wasn't very big, but for classroom teachers who were used to their children coming in every day and for them being able to physically be together, it was a major change. I don't think we learnt a lot from it. I don't think we learnt enough to put into practice, but I think we should. Some of the work in leadership we got from special and inclusive education. All the issues around school-wide culture, policies and practices that Booth and Ainscough talked about come from that context of special and inclusive education. And the notion of leadership for differentiation, the point I have put there from Carol Ann Tomlinson from the United States, who's one of the world leaders in differentiation, just focuses on the importance of leadership for teaching and learning, supporting the use of differentiation. We've mentioned this again. Responsive teachers use evidence and reason. Leadership also has to as well. And many leaders, formal leaders in educational settings, have to do the counting of things and the tallying of things and the reporting about that so that they can be held accountable. I would like to see leaders start to use more of this broader evidence so that you're getting a much deeper, richer understanding of what it is that your educational setting has and is and how you can change it. Another responsibility for leadership is to transform. It's to make change. It's to do it responsively. So rather than coming into a setting thinking you know what needs to happen, it needs to be done in conjunction with those who are already in the setting so that you can build on the strengths that are already there. Effective leaders foster innovation. This is where research evidence is challenging, because when we're told you must use evidence-based practices, that's all very well. Many of our practices have research evidence that validate them. And there are people like Professor John Hattie and David Mitchell in New Zealand, who have spent a lot of time collating, compiling research evidence and trying to make it much more meaningful and sensible for us out here in the real world. And they've done a very good job. However, when you start digging into the existing research in particular areas, you will find that much of it doesn't match our context. So yes, it can give us direction for what we might try. There's no real guarantee. Certainly. I'm sorry about this. We've had a technical glitch. I will see if I can get us back to where we were. It's the trouble when you have a lot of slides. Okay, we were just talking about transformative. I just want to mention the very last point on that slide, that is, educational leaders can influence what's going on within settings, but they can also influence outside the settings. So they can feed information to systems and to broader policymakers and legislators, and that is really important. So leaders who are in official positions need to be connected really, really well with what's going on on the ground, and be able to communicate with people who have influence elsewhere. A key dimension of effective responsive leadership is that it is distributed or shared. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can allocate distinct or separate responsibilities to different people, or you can have some sort of a collaborative, collective structure within which people make joint decisions. In schools, you will usually find there are teams of leaders, and responsive leadership ensures that people's capabilities and expertise are drawn into this collaboration of leadership. There's been some work about professional learning communities that people can explore if they wish to, and the focus in that is on reflection, on inquiring, identifying problems and working towards solving those. Successful leaders, they're generally people who've been successful in teaching, who can build credibility, who have some sense of social cohesion with other people, who are approachable. The other point is that every teacher is a leader. So we're all leaders. We might lead in different ways, and we might lead for different different focuses, different visions, but we are all leaders. And it's interesting when something happens with a group of people somewhere, and you look at it and say, I bet that person's a teacher because they've got everybody organised. It's all going okay. I actually thought that a teacher should be in charge of the COVID vaccinations because it would have all just been done beautifully and would have all just happened. Okay, the last principle is that leadership needs to be sustainable. It is no good if somebody comes in as a leader, makes some wonderful changes, everything's going beautifully, they leave and it all falls through. That is not successful leadership. That's not right. We need to make sure that we are taking people with us, that we go together, and that we establish systems and processes that will remain, that will continue to grow. Okay. I'm just checking the time. Oh dear. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I lost the screen there for a minute. I'd just like to walk you through our responsive leadership framework. To sum up, we think responsive leadership is about teaching and learning. It's inclusive and ethical, it's responsively transformative, it's shared, and it's sustainable. It matches our responsive teaching framework. And on these slides, what I have done is on the left of the slide is the responsive teaching framework, step 1. And on the right is responsive leadership framework, step 1. And the reflective questions that we ask. And the first one for both is, what frameworks do I need to consider? Because everyone works within particular frameworks. We have the physical framework of the school. We have the community, we have education systems, we have the culture that's in the school, we have curriculum requirements, and we have international and national conventions, we have laws, all those things. They're the frameworks within which we have to work. We all need to be conscious of those and understand what responsibilities we have towards them. So that's the first question. The second one is, what do I bring as a leader? And when we did this for teachers, it was about professional skills and knowledge. It was about who am I and how am I seen by my students, by my staff, by the families, by communities. Now, for me, as a British migrant of a number of generations, when I walk into a classroom, I bring the colonisers with me. I'm a settler. And so Aboriginal children in my class will see me as a settler. There's a cultural difference there, and it's a framing. I need to make sure that I can get past that so that they feel safe with me. The next bit is about what capabilities we have. And the last one there is about assumptions. We have lots of assumptions about everything that we teach about. We have assumptions about how students learn. We have assumptions about what learning difficulties are. We have assumptions about what children bring to school with them. We need to understand those and make sense of them and make sure they're not getting in the way of our teaching and the students' learning. And for leaders, that's really important too. The third step in these two frameworks for teachers is about, well, what do my students bring as learners? And we've focused on prior learning and achievement, cultural context, experiences and interests, and they're developing atrium capabilities. So what are their current capabilities? As a leader, we're more broadly interested. We're still interested in that, but we're more broadly interested in the nature of the learning environment, what all the people who come bring to it. At the bottom, I've put assessment decision-making framework. This is the beginning of assessment. And that's another whole lecture, but it's basically looking at why, what, and how we do assessment so that we can find out those things. Step 4 for teachers is, what do I need to teach now? For leaders, it's what do we prioritise? And the research and the writing that I've been into suggests that we should start at a foundational level, at the school culture or whole school level. And in practice, that means things like whole school culture and positive behaviour support, which has been shown to be very effective in setting up really positive learning environments. And then from that, collaboratively determine what is going to happen next, what needs to happen next. You can't change everything at once, and you can't make some big changes without solidifying or consolidating the culture within which you're making those changes. Step 5 is about how do I teach for all my learners? And for leaders, it's about how do we lead that teaching? So if that teaching is about establishing teaching-learning relationships and the environments in classrooms, we're using evidence, we're being culturally responsive, we're being collaborative, we are explicitly teaching when it's needed, we're using cooperative group teaching. We're differentiating and we're using layers of responsive teaching. How can leaders support that? There are many ways we can do it, far too many for us to talk about tonight. I've talked about layers of responsive teaching. This is how we make sense of it. We're not using tiers, which is the current model. We've made ours a bit more transparent, and they can fit with each other. It's not either or, it's a range of things, and you can pick and choose. And the main one is that we have responsive, differentiated classroom teaching. This is layer 1, informed by universal design and moving to responsive differentiation. Step 6, how do I gather evidence of students' learning? And there should be an apostrophe there, I apologise. And for leaders, it's how will we know what difference we've made? So we're looking at what it is that we've managed to change. It's really important. 7 is about, for teachers, it's about giving feedback and how we can give feedback, one of the most powerful aspects of teaching. And the same thing for leaders. But it's also a question about how do the channels for feedback work? So how have the connections and the communication worked? And the last one is the evaluative question. How did my teaching support my students' learning? And for leaders, what worked and what do we do next? So there's nothing magic about those 8 questions. It's just they're really useful ways to help thinkers, both teachers and leaders. This is our complete model of responsive teaching for sustainable learning, and leadership fits over on the right. It needs to lead all those other dimensions that are there, the learning opportunities, the teaching approaches, the teacher-student relationships, the learning environment, connections with community and family. It's a pretty big call. So in conclusion, I would like to thank you for listening to our way of making sense of responsive teaching and responsive leadership. And remember that learning for all, learning that lasts, and teaching that matters is what we want, sustainable learning. So I will just get rid of those slides. Okay. I think we've gone over time already. So I wonder if there are any questions. We have one here from Keying Lee. I agree that every teacher is a leader, but in what ways can we instill this mindset in teachers to bring out the best of students in the classroom? Because not all teachers perceive themselves as leaders. I agree. You don't feel that you're a leader, and you work really, really hard. And many teachers feel safe closing their door and working as an effective teacher with their students. You are leading in a classroom as well, but just about every decision that you're involved in making is leadership. I'm not sure how you help teachers to believe they are leaders. Some will believe they will go on to be in leadership positions, formal leadership positions. But in my experience in schools, just about every teacher will take on some sort of a leadership role, whether it be running the sports carnival or organising the parent-teacher interviews or whatever. So the more opportunities teachers can have to build their capabilities in those areas, connecting with community and facilitating important activities, that would be really good. Okay. I think, Arian, I think I'm going to call it quits. I hope that's okay. I can't hear.
Okay, Professor, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, I've been trying to connect with you. Just give me a second. So, would it be okay if we take two questions from the team that we had got in the past, and then I understand that it's way too late at your time, at your time zone. So one of the questions is to do with your work, Dr. Berman. So while you're engaged in this research that you have translated it into these seminal books, what was the biggest challenge that you encountered while you were assessing and evaluating these diverse systems both in New Zealand and Australia? So what were the challenges that you saw, and what are some of the things that you think could be done differently with those challenges?
With those okay, there's probably lots. As you were asking, I was thinking about the challenges. The challenges of working with 3 other people to come up with a book is pretty profound, and because we all have such demanding other things, but I don't think that's probably what you were talking about. I think I'm going to interpret it as my reflection on what it is that we do as teachers and leaders. And I was only in a rural area in New South Wales. And when I moved to New Zealand, I thought that I'm going to another country that's very, very similar. I'll just slot in, that will be fine, no problem whatsoever. And I get there and the culture is totally different. So I came from a very white culture where Aboriginal cultural protocols and recognition is quite minimal, and went to a place where Maori culture is very significant and is permeating everyday life. It's a bilingual, it's actually a trilingual country. So along with New Zealand Sign Language, we have Maori, Te Reo and English. So signs in a different language, behaviours that were different. I remember in the very first teaching session I sat on the desk, and because I'm quite used to sitting on a desk in a classroom, you're sort of not way up above people, you're not sitting right down with them. But apparently it was a very rude thing for me to do, and completely offensive to Maori people. And once I was told that, I've never done it since. But those sorts of things can make people feel really uncomfortable. I think that was probably the biggest, wake-up call, that there is so much any of us as teachers don't know about what our students are expecting, that we have to negotiate it. We have to ask and find out and share and apologise and don't do it again. So I think it's about talking more and asking people what's appropriate, what's not.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Berman. I think it was quite inspiring to know that negotiation is at the heart of it, and treating young people as equals is one thing that could also help us move more and more towards inclusive learning spaces. I have another question. This is a bit of a question that you'd see from the global south a lot more. The class sizes are pretty large, and I think Divya Mehta has raised this question. So in large class sizes, is it possible to implement the strategies keeping pace with the timeline as well? Because
it's not easy. I say to my students all the time, teaching is the second hardest job in the world. Parenting is the hardest. Teaching is a really challenging job. I think large class sizes and fixed class sizes is really challenging. And this is where leadership needs to come in and think a bit differently about how we can organise the learners that we have and the teachers that we have. And maybe we need to be more flexible about how we group students so that we bring them together for a purpose where they can interact and do something together, or we have large groups when it's an expository lecture. That we need to get cleverer about how we do that sort of thing, because it is really, really difficult. And keeping track of what each student needs at any particular time, and whether they're managing in a large group or whether they need a smaller group, or whether they're not managing in the small group and they would actually be better off in a large. Yes, it's constant, really difficult. No magic wands there, except we need more teachers.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Berman, for taking these questions. I think we still have a few questions out there, but I understand that it's way past your, what do you call?
That's okay. You can keep going.
So then I would take this question. So I think I need a bit more clarity on this question, however, but I'm just posing this. If you have, so one of the questions that there is can you explain more over the process of self-assessment of students in classroom situation according to this global lecture? So the PD event that we were talking about.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure either. Okay, I'll just talk about, yeah, I'm not sure. I think reflection, oh, that's a different one. Okay.
Right.
I think reflection as self-assessment, perhaps. But then it says of students. No, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that's asking.
Yes. So I think, Adam, if you can clarify that, that would be great. But in the meantime, I think I have one question. What inclusive strategies can be used to incorporate SEN students, basically differently abled students requiring sudden medical attention or with Down syndromes?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is life. You know, we have communities where we have people who need sudden medical attention, and and we have children with Down syndrome who perhaps find learning more difficult than some other students, and in my experience can be very determined little people and need very sensitive management. So I think it's still a focus of getting to know what the learners' needs are and making sure that we can cater for them. So if we've got a very directive teacher that maybe the child with Down syndrome responds well to, make sure we are using that particular teacher, or we're using the strategies that that teacher uses. If we need somebody who's softer, then do that. I remember being in schools where they felt it was not the right thing to take into account personality clashes between teachers and students. I think it's absolutely the right thing. Why would you put a teacher or a student together when they're not going to get on? We need to just realise we're humans, and that's one of the aspects of humans. We need the possibility of them getting on really well so that the right strategies can be used. Sudden medical attention, obviously we need to make sure we've got somebody who knows what to do when sudden medical attention is needed, and that all the people who can be have their capabilities built so they can do it as well. You would work towards everyone being responsible and able to respond, but that's not reality in many places. So you need to make sure you have access to someone who knows what they're doing and can do that really effectively.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Berman. One of the things that I really felt was interesting was when you said we have 3 languages in our country as opposed to saying 2. So I think that's a perspective shift in the way we look at languages and inclusion. So I think that was really interesting, Dr. Berman, to see how you categorized and included sign language as one of the one of the languages of your country. So
Yeah.
I think similar practices could work even with schools. A lot of schools have sign language as a part of it, but to recognize it as a mainstream thing that the school engages in. So I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
We have formally come towards the end of this discussion. Dr. Berman, it was quite enlightening to hear you talk about your work and about your discoveries all throughout. So, as I shared with you, this is the culmination of the 24th Educational Leadership Forum, and it could not have ended on a higher note than today. So thank you so much for sharing that one, Dr. Berman. So on behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for Global Citizenship Education, and all our attendees, I extend our deepest gratitude to you for taking out the time out of your busy schedule and enriching us with this discourse through your unique ideas, insights, and experiences. Also, to all our audiences, thank you so much for being part of the Education Leadership Forum and for everything you've been doing to advance this discourse on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. We really, really appreciate the time, insights, and efforts that you all have contributed to driving this extremely crucial discussion towards shaping the futures of education for generations of young people. We'll be moving to the lounge networking area right now at the end of this. So once again, Dr. Berman, thank you for honoring our invitation to lead the Global Distinguished Lecture and for sharing your insights with the attendees. So if you have any questions that we may not have been able to cover or answer sufficiently, please write to us. We may direct the responses to Dr. Berman, and perhaps we might have some discussion around this in the future. So your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, and feedback are valuable to us. So please don't hesitate to share them by emailing us or tagging us on our social media posts. So creating an educational environment that is intentional, inclusive, empathetic, compassionate, and mindful is crucial for the growth, development, and success of all learners and educators. It is the responsibility of every leader in the education space to shape policies and practices that can foster such an ecosystem. So, with educators, school leaders, and students all working together, we have the power and potential to effect a positive transformation in the field of education and in society. So, see you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, spread love and compassion. Our world needs it more. Thank you.